Go.
Okay. I got a big thing that says the meeting is being recorded, so I guess I put got it. Uh-oh, wait a minute. Oh, no. Okay. So today we're going to talk about Cahaba prison. And of course, I got into Cahaba prison because about half of the guys that ended up on the Sultana when I was studying the Sultana had been in Cahaba prison, and I had never heard of it, and most people never have either. But the reason that Cahaba prison was started was because in the spring of 1862, McClellan was moving up the peninsula towards Richmond. And at that time, early in the war, after Bull Run and Ball's Bluff, if you were captured within a month or so, you were usually exchanged. The northern soldier, a private in the north and a private from the south, they would be exchanged, a lieutenant for a lieutenant, captain for a captain, and etc. However, as the war progressed, these prisons that they had, and they had put some of these prisons in Richmond, Virginia. As McClellan in the spring of 1862 was moving up the peninsula towards Richmond, the Confederates were worried that if he did capture Richmond, they could always move the capital of the Confederacy, but all these guys would be released. So they decided, we're going to start looking for some prison camps more in the interior. And one of the places that they decided was way down here in Alabama, near Selma, Alabama. And Selma, Cahaba is actually 27 miles southwest of Cahaba. That 27 river miles. It's actually a little bit shorter than that, but again, even if you drive it today, it's a winding road, and it might be 25 miles of winding road. It sits at the confluence of the Cahaba River and the Alabama River. So it is south. The Alabama River will run southwest like this. The Cahaba River runs down this way, and it's right at the confluence there. This is an actual picture taken from a drone of the site today. And you can see the Cahaba River is really a muddy river. It's not really deep. It's not really fast flowing. And here's the Alabama River. And when the two meet, you can see the Alabama, because it's got a little bit more power, will push to the side the Cahaba water until it gets further downstream, and eventually they will mix together and be this dirty brown color again. But it is a lighter colored river at this point at the confluence. Cahaba had actually been the first state capital of Alabama from 1820 to 1826, as you see from the sign, which is there at the site of historic Cahaba today. However, and Jim and I were talking about this, because it sat right next to the Alabama River and the Cahaba River, whenever those rivers would flood, it would flood out the town of Cahaba. So eventually what they will do is they will move the capital to Tuscaloosa, and then Cahaba, and it is spelled Cahaba with the W and without the W. It doesn't matter. People down there will accept either one. As you can see, even their sign has it spelled Cahaba down here and Cahaba with the W up above. It was spelled after the Cahaba Indians from that area. Eventually, Cahaba becomes the county seat of that area until, again, the flooding just really screws things up. And in fact, the flooding in 1865, which I will reference, is what finally tells them, hey, we got to move the capital, the county seat, from Cahaba to Selma. This is a 1900 photograph of Cahaba after it basically become a ghost town. And you can see some of the buildings that were there, and they would have been there at the time of the use as a prison, and a little bit afterwards. But again, the constant flooding of the river, which would be from where we're sitting, flow out this way, really wrecked the town, and now it became a ghost town. In the middle of the town here, I do want you to notice there is a little well, and the well would also flow this little stream here, and this will actually be the water for the prison camp. I'll mention that a little later also. There's not much left. If you go to historic Cahaba today, there's not much left there at all. This building here is there, and it is not. This is part of the Stephen Barker plantation. It's not the plantation house. The plantation house was dismantled, and the bricks were taken to Selma and used to build bricks there. This is the house in the background, the slave quarters. This was the slave quarter, and it's still there today. And this is it in this photograph. This is the ruins of the Methodist Church. If you can see in the picture here on the side, the pillars there's one or two of these pillars still standing today, but that's all that remains of the Methodist Church. And one of the probably most visited spots when you go to Old Cahaba is the Crocheron plantation, because this is where Union General James Wilson met with Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest after the Battle of Selma to try to work out some type of a ceasefire for the gathering the wounded and the prisoners and such like that. This is all that's left, these beautiful columns. And the columns are actually these 4 side columns on the side of this house. So the whole rest of the house had been dismantled. And as I said, they used these bricks, moved them up to Selma and used them to build part of Selma, Alabama. This was the way the town of Cahaba was supposed to be laid out in the 1890s. It was actually, by 1860, it had a population of around 2,000 people, but only 720 of those were whites. The rest of them, 64%, were black slaves. This was a big cotton area. A lot of cotton was shipped down the Cahaba River or down the Alabama River, and there was a railroad that came down this main street here and ended right at the base of the Alabama River. Well, in 1860, early 1860, an enterprising man named Samuel Hill began to construct a cotton warehouse at the end of it would have been over here where this green marker is, at the end of this railroad. And they would then take, cotton from the interior brought in by the Greensboro, Marion, and Cahaba Railroad would have been stored in this until steamboats coming down the river would pick it up and take it down to Mobile, Alabama. However, the war will start before he is done and before this project of his gets underway. Now, the warehouse will eventually become part of the prison, and it was named Castle Morgan. Now, if you talk to the people there at Cahaba, they will say it was named after John Hunt Morgan, the Confederate raider. But John Hunt Morgan was a Virginian, and in 1862, he really wasn't even that well known. So for them to name the prison after John Hunt Morgan, I question that. Now, in the Selma Cemetery, Live Oak Cemetery, there is a marker there, and you'll see John Tyler Morgan was a U.S. Senator from Cahaba, and he was also later a Brigadier General of the Confederacy. I believe that Castle Morgan was named after ex-Senator John Tyler Morgan, who was from that area. But again, it's neither here nor there. This is what the warehouse looked like. It was 193 feet long, 116 feet wide, and had walls 14 feet high. Notice here, the center of it was never finished. For some reason, when Mr. Hill was making this, he never took and completed the middle section of the warehouse. It was built right alongside the Alabama River. And again, if you were storing your cotton in here, this was an easy place where if a steamboat came, you could take the cotton out of the warehouse, run it down the bank, and right onto a waiting steamboat. And again, you can even see in this drawing here, there is no middle to it, no roof over the middle of it. This again is a drone shot of that area. This is what modern day Cahaba looks like today. And again, look at the river down here. You can see where the Alabama the Cahaba River still hasn't taken and really melded with the Alabama River. But this is the location of where the prison would have been. If you go there today, there is really nothing. I'll show you that in just a second. This is how it would have looked. It would have had the cotton warehouse here. And what they would do is they will build a wall around the outside of it. And it's a 14-foot stockade. They're going to leave a little cook area out in front here. which is where the guys could come out, build little fires, cook their stuff, get all the smoke and everything going there. But at night, everybody had to leave this open area and go into the warehouse area. And then the doors were locked. So during the day, probably at night too, you had guards walking around, just like at Andersonville, walking around on an elevated platform built on the outside of the walls, and they could look down inside. And of course, you had the deadline and everything else that was there. Again, if we take that, the size of the warehouse and the size of the stockade and place it today, this is about where it would be in modern day Cahaba. This is what it looks like. The spot where the prison was is nothing. There's really nothing there. And I'll talk about this thing in just a second. We had gone there with our Sultana Descendants Association, and we had a meeting there and met with everybody. And we, a lot of their ancestors had been in Cahaba, so they wanted to see. Well, this is a couple of the park rangers that work there, the state rangers, stood, and you got the one lady is all the way back here and the fellow is up here, and this would have been the line of where the prison camp wall would have been. Now you will see this chimney here, and of course when we got there, everybody got off the bus and ran over and started taking pictures, because there's a picture of the only remaining thing from Cahaba. But in actuality, it's not. That was built there in about the 1890s, so it has nothing to do with the prison. It's probably one of the most photographed pieces of old Cahaba, but it has nothing to do with the prison. So just sort of ignore that. Now, Cahaba, there was a house. I don't know if you can see or if we have our people. Let me see if I can change my. There we go. The house on the side here was Mrs. Amanda Gardner. She lived close to the warehouse. The guys could see her. She was a Southern lady, but she felt sorry for these guys, and she would bring them some food, some little blankets, scraps of clothing and stuff like that. But the most important thing that she brought them was books. These guys that were crammed inside here were bored stiff. So she would bring them books, she would loan it to them. And of course, then they had book reading societies where one guy would read and 100 people would sit there and listen to it. And depending on where you are, you might hear one book in one corner and one book being read in the other corner. It got to be where this is an actual picture of her home. It is not there today. This was taken, I don't know when, like the 1930s or 20s or something, but this building is no longer there at all. The soldiers used to take in that front area where they would be able to go close to the gate. They would actually go up to the gate and stare through the cracks and stuff and look for Mrs. Amanda. But more than that, what they were looking, Amanda Gardner, what they were actually looking for was her 16-year-old daughter, because she would sometimes come out and bring these guys the books or just get out and shake a mop or whatever. And these guys just loved watching 16-year-old Isabella Gardner. Now, the main water source, I had showed you the picture of the downtown of Cahaba in 1900, where that well was. Water would flow from that well, underground spring, and just flow along and then eventually come down past the prison and actually turn into it. And this was the water, the main course through the town. It was the main water for through the town and also the prison. And Perry Somerville from the 2nd Indiana Cavalry said, the water passed through the city in pipes to a hydrant outside the prison where the livestock came to drink. The people would wash there, and then the water would pass down through the prison for use to drink and cook with. But it was one of the purest articles we got, he said. So before it got to the people, the cows and the horses had drunk out of it. People had thrown stuff into it. But again, it was water and it was flowing water, and they were glad to get it. Excuse me. There was a deadline inside the stockade wall, and it was put up similar to what the ones that they have. If you have ever been to Andersonville, it's put up about maybe 10 feet away from the stockade wall. And if you got, actually, this is a picture from Andersonville, but if you're not supposed to go over the line. If you stepped over the line, put your foot over the line or anything, a guard in those watchtowers could shoot at you. And again, both of these illustrations are from Andersonville, but I thought they were great in illustrating what I have to tell you. And again, Perry Somerville will say, I was standing near a comrade one day who happened to get his foot on the deadline. The guard above shot at his foot, barely missing it, and the ball glanced back, striking the roof of the guard tower. So these guys were not playing around. They wanted to keep you away from the wall, but you could go up close to the gate and look for Miss Amanda Gardner or her daughter. Now, inside the warehouse, they also had a deadline. So once they locked you in at night, there were guards that would walk around the outside and keep you from getting too close, so you weren't trying to pick out some of the bricks and try to, scurry through the wall or something like that. So Private John Lowry, this is the best picture we have of him. I apologize for that. But he said, at night, we were always driven into the square brick enclosure, and inside this enclosure was another deadline with about 20 Confederate soldiers on guard. So these guys were constantly under watch. The prison was opened in April of 1862 after the Battle of Shiloh. Shiloh was the largest battle on the American continent at that time, and there were so many Union soldiers captured, the South just didn't know what to do with them, especially because they were captured in the Western Theater. And so they sent them down to Cahaba. The Confederacy had purchased the old warehouse, had built up this stockade. And so the first guys to really come here were prisoners from Shiloh. 1 year later, the Confederacy refused to exchange black soldiers. After 1861, January of 1861, when Lincoln put out the Emancipation Proclamation and now was recruiting black soldiers, the South said, well, we ain't treating them as soldiers. We're going to treat them as ex-slaves. And so Lincoln issued on July 30th, 1863, General Order 252, which closed off all exchanges. No more exchanges were going to happen until the South recognized that African-American soldiers were soldiers. If you've been reading it, you can see there was only bunks underneath the covered areas for 432. Everybody else had to sleep out in the open. Now, because of Lincoln's General Order 252 and no more exchanges, the South knew that they were going to need more prison camps if they were going to have to hold on to these guys. Cahaba was getting more and more full. So in February of 1863, they will open Andersonville Prison in Andersonville, Georgia there. And of course, this was called Camp Sumter. What'll happen is all of the prisoners at Cahaba are going to be shifted over to Andersonville, and Cahaba will become a way station. It's just sort of, you're there for a couple of days before you're sent on to Andersonville. Eventually, Andersonville will get so crowded, it'll have 30,000 people once General Grant starts his overland campaign, fighting around the Spotsylvania and the Wilderness and Cold Harbor. And so it got so crowded that they decided, okay, we're going to have to reopen Cahaba and use it as a prison camp again. So the guys that will end up on the Sultana are the second group of people that will go into Cahaba, not that first group, although some of them had been transferred to Andersonville and will also end up later on in the Sultana. So this is the main gate in the cooking area. And when the guys arrived here in the fall of 1864, now these are the guys that are, being captured in either the Western campaigns or the Grant's overland campaign. Private Walker will say, I remember entering, he says, we were taken to the prison, the gates were open, and we were pushed in like so many cattle. The familiar greeting of fresh fish came from our comrades who had been there for some time previous to our arrival. Sort of tongue-in-cheek, Walker wrote, we found the place, though not an up-to-date hotel, well patronized by some 3,000 guests. There was no elevator service required, for we were all accommodated on the ground floor. And Private Somerville wrote, as I entered the prison, the boys hollered, fresh fish, which was an article I was standing in need of at the time. In other words, she was pretty hungry. Now, coming into the prison for the first time, Hosea Aldrich, who I do not have a picture of, he came in October of 1864 and said, "I shall never forget the first glimpse I caught of the inmates as we marched in. Some of the poor fellows had been there 6 or 8 months. They had cut their hair as close as possible to keep off the vermin. Some of them had nothing on but a pair of drawers, no cover for the head or feet, and were tanned nearly black from the Alabama sun." Of course, food was a big thing in every prison. And of course, the guys that were held in Cahaba also wrote about the lack of food. Private Jacob Homer will write, "As to our rations, some days we drew and some days not. We drew about a tinful of meat to the man, sometimes half a tinful, according to how they felt. Some days we got meal and some days none. Half the time we had no salt." And he writes, "One piece of meat they brought had an abscess as large as the crown of my hat. The pus or matter ran out over the meat as we cut close to it. I tell you, it was a bad piece." And he also wrote, "One day the prisoners were treated to horse meat. They were taking this horse across the river, and he broke through a plank on the ferry boat and broke his leg. They killed it and brought the meat in for us to eat. It did not taste bad, but was very coarse and blue." And again, when you're in prison, I guess you eat whatever you can and whatever they give you. Now, again, because they were not getting the rations that they had gotten when they were in the Union Army or when they were at home, they did lose weight. I've showed this picture in my Sultana presentation, but I love showing it because John Henry King was held at Cahaba. And in this before and after picture, you can see how full his face is, how full his chest is and stuff. And then this was after he was released. You can see the sunken cheeks here. His chest has no, masculinity in it anymore. And of course, his clothing is all beaten up from wearing it every single day while he was in Cahaba prison. One of his comrades, Jacob Horn or Philip Horn, would write, let's see, I got to get the right one here. "I was a big boy when I went into the war at the age of 17. 200 pounds is my normal weight. But when I arrived home after 7 months in prison, I weighed less than 100 pounds. I was a gaunt frame of bones." So he'd lost over 100 pounds in prison in Cahaba. Commodore Smith of the 18th Michigan Infantry said, "My weight when captured on September 24th, 1864 was 175 pounds. And when I was released on March 16th, 1865, 6 months later, my weight was 94 pounds, although I had not been sick one day while in prison." So he had lost over 75 pounds while in prison. Another thing that these guys were worried about, not only food, but hunting graybacks. That's what they called them. Of course, that's hunting lice. And they really had, when you're out, all Civil War soldiers suffered from lice, it seemed. But at least if you're free and if you're, in a regiment and stuff, you can go into a stream, you can wash your clothes in a stream or whatever. When you're confined in prison, if one guy let his hygiene go bad, those lice would multiply and infect, and pretty soon the whole prison is fighting or hunting graybacks. And again, this man Peter Rosselot from the 50th Ohio, he said, "About this time I had to go on the skirmish line every day so as to keep our little friends from getting too numerous, else they would have carried us away." I'm sure he's exaggerating, but you never know. And again, Private or Sergeant Hosea Aldrich, again, I don't have a picture of him. He wrote, "We had to skirmish every day. That is, to sit on the ground, take off our garments one at a time, hunt the seams over, and between our thumbnails, demolish the knits and older ones that we could find. And that generally was a large number. To feel them crawl and bite was additional creeping torture. You can just imagine." Upon entering Cahaba, Private Walker said he spotted, as he came in, he spotted a group that something was going on. He said it was quite a number of prisoners huddled together. Being a curious person, he worked his way into the center, and he said he saw a most revolting sight. As he related, quote, In the center of that group was one poor fellow who, having been negligent of his person, was being stripped of his clothing by a committee of his fellow prisoners. I can never forget the sight of his head. It was a solid mass of corruption, covered with vermin and actually alive, as the scalp literally swayed from side to side. As Walker watched, the committee had been formed to take care of men found in this condition. Walker continued, their clothing was all removed, their hair cropped as close to the scalp as possible, and the men themselves plunged into a large vat of water and thoroughly scrubbed with a brush. So Walker was saying if a prisoner did not take care of himself, this committee would make sure that the lice were killed, because again, they didn't want it infesting everybody to that extent. Now, one of the reasons why Cahaba is probably not that well known is there was not a big death rate there. And that is because the commander of the prison was this man here, Howard Andrew Millet, or Ham Henderson. This is a photograph cropped from a larger one, so it's not that clear. And this is a sort of a photograph of him, but almost a drawing photograph. He had been a Baptist minister before the war. He will become a Baptist minister after the war. He treated these prisoners, Union prisoners, so well that later on at the Sultana Survivors Association, he will be invited to the association meetings and he will give speeches. And the guys did not mind him being there. They welcomed him into their midst. In fact, he will be the presiding minister at the funeral of at Ulysses S. Grant's mother. That's how well respected Ham Henderson was. At the death rate at other prisons in the North, the death rate was 12%. In the South, the death rate was 15.5%. Of course, at Andersonville Prison, the death rate was an astonishing 29% of the men that went in there never came out. But at Cahaba, the death rate was only 2%. And that was because Howard Henderson, or Ham Henderson, really, really respected these guys, tried to do the best he could under the circumstances that he had. In fact, Private Walker wrote of Henderson, he was a man who was held in the highest esteem by all the prisoners for his kind and considerate manner towards them at all times. Now, in September of 1864, Henderson will actually take a white flag of truce and go into Union lines at Memphis. And he asks the Union authorities at Memphis if they could send supplies to his prisoners. He says, your clothing is falling apart. We need medicine. We need writing paper. We need food. Could you send it through? These are your men. They're being held by the Confederacy, but they're your men. So on December 24th, actually, the day before Christmas, a steamboat arrives with 2,000 coats and hats, 2,000 pair of pants, drawers, shoes, socks, blankets, writing paper, envelopes, and medical supplies. These guys, when they got it, they thought it was a Christmas present. In fact, John M. Phillips of the 5th Tennessee Cavalry, who I also do not have a photograph of, went and said, here we stayed, many barefooted, bareheaded, and otherwise destitute of clothing till the day before Christmas, when the government sent us each a pair of socks, pants, cap, 2 blankets for every 3 men, and a blue blouse. They were so happy. It was a wonderful Christmas for those being held at Cahaba. Now, despite how well the prison was run, again, the food was not the best. They did have problems with the lice. And there were, of course, some escape attempts. And the easiest way to do was to try to dig down somehow without the guards seeing you, and dig down sideways and come out on the riverbank, drop down into the Cahaba River, float down the river, get out, and try to maybe make your way to Union lines, Mobile, or later on towards the Atlanta area where Sherman was. Most of the guys were recaptured. There were some successful escape attempts, but most of the guys were recaptured and brought back. One of the largest escape attempts in all of the entire Civil War, and I'm talking even Libby Prison. You remember Libby Prison was an officer prison, and you had 100 and so many guys try to or did escape from Libby Prison. But Cahaba Prison is the only prison camp where there is going to be a mass 3,000 person escape attempt. It was run by this man here, Captain Hiram Solon Hatchett, from the 16th Illinois Infantry and Cavalry, and happened on January 20, 1865. He decided that since there's 3,000 of us and there's only 100 or 150 guards, we can overpower the guards. We can get into the town of Cahaba. We can hold it. We can then march across country to try to link up with the Union forces, which are now holding at Atlanta, or somehow get into the bummers that are marching with Sherman. Hatchett will try the attempt, and Charles M. Eldridge, the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, he will report what happens, because the first thing they have to do is at night is grab those guards that are on the deadline inside of the warehouse. And Charles Eldridge said the inside men carried out their part all right, but some fellows, seeing what was being done and not knowing what it meant, because they didn't tell all 3,000, began to holler that to those on the outside, "Don't do that, boys, they will all be killed." So because they had not been told that there's a mass escape attempt, they started screaming and yelling, and of course the Confederates on the outside heard this. John Lowry Walker will write, all of the captured inside guards were put in one corner of the shed, which was used as an outhouse, and 3 of our men were placed on guard over them. In a very few minutes, the main gate, as they opened up the doors of the warehouse and looked out into that cook area, he says, in a very few minutes, the main gate was thrown open and a 12-pound cannon and 2 companies of infantry, Confederate infantry, was ready for action. The man in charge of the prison at this time was Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Sam Jones. He was the second in command at Cahaba. He was actually the person in charge of the guards. When he heard this ruckus inside and these guys shouting, they wheeled in a cannon, pointed at the main doors of the warehouse, and he lined his men up along the walkways and inside that cookyard with their rifles ready to shoot. The attempt had failed, and the men stacked the rifles in the yard and let the prisoners go. Private Eldridge explained, the next morning, they brought in a heavy guard and drove us back to one side of the prison, and having every man in the prison stripped perfectly bare, and then passed between 2 doctors, holding our hands over our heads, hunting for the man who was stuck with a bayonet, but they failed in that too. Apparently, when these guys grabbed the guards on the inside of that deadline, one of the guards remembered stabbing somebody with his bayonet. And they said, oh, all we have to do is find that person and we can interrogate him and find out who the mastermind of this escape attempt was, or who the leaders were. And so what they did was they had these guys take off all their clothes, hold their clothes above their head, and they walked between 2 lines of Confederates looking at them to see if they could spot any wounds on their body, but they didn't. And Corporal Erastus Winters will explain, the Rebs made every man strip and pass through their lines in the endeavor to find the man hurt with the bayonet. I always understood he was slightly wounded in the hand and passed their line without being detected, holding his clothes in his hands above his head, hiding his wound. So yes, somebody had been stabbed, but they've been stabbed in the hand, and when they're holding their clothes is absorbing any blood coming out, and the Confederates are not seeing it. So they got away with it. However, Lieutenant Colonel Jones was not done with these guys, and he said he locks them in the warehouse, and Truman Smith will report they furnished neither rations nor allowed us to build a fire until our leader should be produced. For 3 days, we had nothing to eat and no fire. And then Captain Hatchett, the guy from Illinois, gave himself up, saying it was better that he should die than should hundreds, who would surely perish in their famished condition. Captain Hatchett was walked out by Lieutenant Colonel Jones and put in the city prison in Cahaba. Hatchett will stay in the city prison until April 3rd, 1865, when he is brought out to be exchanged. Now, some of the prisoners inside the prison can see that. They're looking through the slats in the wall and the door, and they can see that he's being brought out. What happens is Lieutenant Colonel Jones and a squad will walk him about 2 miles into the woods, and then they take and kill him. So Private Hanchett, his body was never found. There is a grave there at Cahaba, but it's just a memorial grave. And his body was never found, and Lieutenant Jones was never held responsible for killing Captain Hanchett. Jones was still in charge in April of actually end of March, early April 1865, when the Cahaba River, or the Alabama River, started to overflow. It was a very terrible winter of 1864 up in the north. All the snows are melting, flooding the rivers. This is, of course, going to lead to the Mississippi being overflowed. And while the Sultana will go upriver against this high flood stage river. And the same thing happened in the Alabama River. It flowed up the banks and actually flooded into the prison itself. Henry Kuntz with the 18th Michigan Infantry wrote, although we thought we were on the highest point of land, the rise of water was such that it overflowed the whole grounds of our prison and remained so about 6 days, varying in depth from knee to waist deep. Thus, we were continually in the water up to our knees, and in search for a better place to stand, were often in water above our waists, owing to the unevenness of the ground. The river banks were lowest below us, and the waters entered the prison by backing up from that direction. Our privies, or toilets, were located at the lower end of the prison, and as the water backed up, it raised all the human excrement and filth to mingle with the water, which all floated up into our prison, remaining there for several days. Now, of course, as I had mentioned, there were some beds built. There were sort of racks of beds. Well, the guards are going to stand on those. And some of the prisoners that were able to get onto those, they would sit there for a few hours and then change places with somebody that had been standing in the water for the last few hours. So there was this rotation basis. Well, eventually what's going to happen is there's going to be a steamboat come down river and take away the sickest guys and bring them up to Selma. And eventually there's going to be an exchange made, and steamboats will come down and evacuate all these guys from the overflooded prison. Because what is happening in Vicksburg, Mississippi, Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, now he's been promoted to a lieutenant colonel, and Major Watts, both of the Confederate exchange commissions, has gone to Vicksburg. The first time they went to Memphis, now they go to Vicksburg, and they met with a Captain Archie Fisk, and they said, Captain Henderson said the same thing. We got guys here in Cahaba that are sick. Their clothing is falling off of them. Could you send them some clothes and some food like we did before? And Captain Archie Fisk says, I'll do you one better. Since the Confederacy is falling apart, why don't you bring all your people out of Cahaba and even out of Andersonville, Georgia, bring them here to Vicksburg. They will be housed in an exchange camp 4 miles outside of the city. It will still be run by the Confederacy. In other words, these will still be Confederate prisoners. However, we will take and we will supply them with food, medicine, clothing, whatever they need. So we'll take care of supplying the soldiers. The North will supply them. The South will still be in charge of them. Colonel Henderson agrees with this. And so Camp Fisk, neutral exchange camp, will be set up 4 miles outside of the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. When these guys hear on March 6th, when these guys hear that they are to be leaving Cahaba, Jack Collins here wrote, finally, to our intense joy and relief, word came that we were to be sent to the exchange camp at Vicksburg, Mississippi, to be exchanged. Words cannot begin to express our feelings when we knew that we were again to leave that horrible hole. Hearts full of gratitude and thanksgiving to the great Almighty beat riotously in the bosom of every prisoner, and the tears coursed unrestrainedly down every cheek when the glad news was made known. So these guys were going home. They were being released and out of the prison. Even though this was one of the best run prisons, still they wanted out. What's going to happen is the prisoners are going to be moved from Cahaba, which is about just below Selma, down the Alabama River until it confluence with the Tombigbee River. They're not going to be sent all the way to Mobile because Mobile is actually being attacked by Union forces. You have hostile Union forces here. So what happens is they are brought up, the steamboats go up the Tombigbee River to Demopolis, where they're put on a train over to Meridian, and from Meridian to Jackson, Mississippi. From Jackson, Mississippi, they have to go 8 miles all the way to Vicksburg, or to the exchange camp. The only problem is the train tracks have been torn down between Jackson and Vicksburg. So these guys are going to have to walk the 8 miles from Jackson, Mississippi, all the way to the Big Black River, where there is a pontoon bridge. And again, Private Eldridge will say, my feet had been sore and chapped all winter from being barefooted, and from having to be in the water at Cahaba. They had cracked open so that when I started to march, they opened the crack. That opened the cracks till they were bleeding all over the top. But I was so elated over the thought of getting out of prison that I kept going, although I was so weak I could hardly keep up. This is the picture of a pontoon bridge over the Big Black River. This is the Big Black River. This is a pontoon bridge. Probably not the one that the soldiers will go over, but it's going to be very similar to what they did. On this side was the Confederacy. On this side was the Union. And you had Union guards on one side and you had Confederate guards on the other. And as the guys came up to it, the Confederates would look through their books, call off a name, and the guy would then walk, or more likely run, across this bridge until he was on Union land. Private Eldridge will again say, I was almost ready to give up, being weak from starvation and exposure while in prison, and being sick anyway. So along about 4 o'clock in the evening, I heard those in front begin to holler and run, and I didn't understand what it meant until I got further, where I could see. And it was because they had gotten sight of the old stars and stripes again. So on the far side, there was a flagpole and the Union flag was hanging there. Eldridge said, I can't express my feelings. I hollered until I was completely exhausted, my strength being all gone from joy to think I was out of prison and would soon be free again. So many of these guys, when they got across that bridge, they ran up to that flagpole and they held on to it and they just stood there and cried their eyes out, because as far as they were concerned, they were back in God's country. Once they were across the bridge, they were taken another 4 miles to the parole camp. It was called a little way station there called 4 Mile Bridge, and that's where they had set up this Camp Fisk. A newspaper reporter wrote, 800 of our men have already arrived at this camp, and more will soon reach it from the rebel prison pen at Cahaba and other places in Mississippi and Alabama. The prisoners already arrived, came day before yesterday evening. They have suffered greatly from the want of necessary clothing and by exposure to the inclemencies of the weather, but do not complain of a scarcity of food adequate for their support. Their ration was simple but sufficient. They appear very ragged, but hardy and cheerful. After being brought over, and here, this is an actual picture of Camp Fisk. It had black guards, Negro guards there. So this is one of the U.S. colored troop guarding it. And you can see in among the tent here, some of the guys some of the prisoners standing probably roll call. Here's a closer picture of these guys standing roll call or standing around the tents. They had nothing to do while they were in Camp Fisk. They took roll call, they sat around, they ate, tried to put on a little bit of weight, build up their muscles a little before their release home. The reporter continued saying, after being ferried over the Big Black River, the prisoners were at once put on board the cars and brought to the camp for their reception at 4 Mile Bridge. Here they will remain together with others as they arrive until rebel prisoners held by us can be brought down the river, when an exchange will take place at this camp, which is accounted neutral ground to both parties to the agreement. Guards for the camp will be furnished from the forces at this post in Vicksburg, and rations and all necessary supplies of every kind of the prisoners will be taken from the U.S. government commissaries here. So these guys, this was a blessing in disguise for them. They came into this camp waiting to be exchanged, and the exchange really never occurred. For some reason, the Confederate prisoners being held up in the north were never sent downriver, or if some of them were, but very, very little. So it took weeks before these guys were eventually released. And in the meantime, the prisoners from Andersonville will show up. And if the Cahaba prisoners thought that they looked bad, wait until they saw the Andersonville ones. They made comments that it was heartbreaking to see the trains pull up from the Big Black River, and the Cahaba prisoners had to help the Andersonville prisoners get off of the trains. That's how weak they were. And again, they will sit there for 2 or 3 weeks until the end of April 24th, when the first steamboat, a load of prisoners will be sent north. The Confederacy has fallen apart. There's no more reason to hang on to them, and the Confederate prison commissioners are told, just release the guys. Don't wait for a man-to-man exchange. Just send these poor guys home. And of course, on April 24th, the Sultana will be loaded with close to 2,000 of these guys, the last men being held at Camp Fisk. And when the Sultana's boilers explode, about half of the guys on board had come from Andersonville, and the other half had come from Cahaba. The Cahaba guys were terribly weakened. The Andersonville guys were terribly weakened. The Cahaba guys, not much better, but in the cold, flowing, freezing waters and the panic and people grabbing onto you, it didn't matter whether you were a Cahaba prisoner or an Andersonville prisoner. Chances are you were going to go down. So that is why 56% of the guys on board the Sultana will lose their lives. That concludes my presentation, and I don't know if I can get out of this. Oh, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Uh-oh. Did I lose everybody? No, there we go. Okay. I'm sort of there. Oh, you are still sharing the screen. I got to stop sharing the screen. Or do I stop share? Okay, there I am. I'm back.
All right.
So that concludes. Any questions? Any comments?
Hang on, folks. First of all, this was very good, Gene.
Thank you. Thank you.
It really was. Now, let me stop the recording, because we don't want to record everybody asking silly questions, Tom. And give me a sec, and then we will, yeah.
Okay.